This is the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre seminar series. The session is being recorded, so just to keep that in mind, and thank you to Anna from the Research Office for all the support that she gives to us in the centre and to our seminar series. So I am Louise Ryan. I am Director of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, and I'm joined today by Dr. Maria Lopez, who is the Deputy Director, and she and I will be co-chairing. Before I introduce the speaker, if I could just ask people to avoid putting loads and loads of stuff in the chat because it can become a bit overwhelming. But if you could please use the chat to write any questions or comments for the speaker. We will go through the presentation without interruption, and then we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So at the end, you can either put your hand up and turn your microphone on and ask your question, or if you prefer, you can type your question in the chat. So without further ado, I would now like to hand over to my colleague Maria Lopez, who is going to introduce our speaker, who used to be at London Met and has now left London Met for Oxford Brookes University. So Maria, as you know Jessie well, perhaps you'd like to introduce her.
Yes, my pleasure. Yes, and many of you will know Jessie, of course. We are still, we miss her a lot. She just left to another university. I don't even want to mention that. She was one of our great lecturers, very popular among students and colleagues, supportive and professional as she only could be. So today she's here to present her findings, a bit of her findings for her book that she published about universal basic income. And she will outline some of the implications of this notion, what that means, and in particular for women, and the problems women have to get access to that. So Jessie, all to you. I'm very looking forward to listen to your findings for that fantastic book.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that introduction. Indeed, I was teaching at London Met until very recently. I was at the institution for over 10 years, so quite a very long time, and had agreed to talk about some of this, the notion of UBI. I really wanted to go ahead and deliver the session, although it's happening after I left, because it's a very interesting notion. There are lots of different ideas about universal basic income, but there are some really exciting data and also fresh pilots and experiments in the UK. So I think it makes it quite relevant to discuss now. And also the way in which it could help women integrate into the world of work is still debated, is hotly debated, and the book, in fact, has a very important contribution, which is a full chapter on the work of women and UBI. So I'll be touching upon that throughout the presentation. So thank you very much. Can we have the slides up? I can't see them myself. I'm not sure why. Oh, there they are. Brilliant. Okay. Okay, so that's me. I now work at Oxford Brookes. If you'd like to contact me by email, it's probably easier just to look up my email address at Oxford Brookes University. Right. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the findings from this book, Universal Basic Income, which I published in 2019 with Brian McDonough. We wrote it together. I wrote the chapter on the work of women, and I also wanted to highlight that the book itself is actually published as part of a Key Ideas in Sociology for Routledge. So it's been published with several other really important titles, which is the series is really focusing on developing innovative ideas in sociology. And it's a really important book because it's touching on an aspect of sociology which is sort of developing at the moment. So what is a universal basic income? So lots of people have said many things about basic income, but in all, A basic income is a regular cash income payment, which is paid to all individuals without means test or work requirement. So the basic income is universal because it's paid to all in any given community or a society, whether or not individuals are rich or poor, whether they work or whether they don't work. So it's different to the system that we currently have, whereby people stop receiving benefits once they go over, for example, an amount of hours. It's also been called a citizen's wage, a citizen's income, an unconditional, automatic, sort of non-withdrawable payment to each individual. And it's been called a universal dividend, a universal grant, or guaranteed universal subsidy. So it's got lots of different names that it's been given since its introduction. We decided to go for universal basic income because it encompasses all of these terms, but it's also important to know the difference between a basic income, a universal basic income, and things that are more means tested. So it might appear as a crazy idea for some people, a far-flung idea, a utopian idea, whereby everyone receives a payment just because of the citizenship. But in fact, it's been trialed across the globe, and I'll go through some of these examples in a moment. So, for example, there's the Alaska's Permanent Fund dividend. There's also the experiment in India, in Madhya Pradesh, which is called unconditional cash transfers. There's also a basic income grant experiment in Namibia, in Kenya as well. So they all vary in terms of how much money people actually receive. So just to give you an example, in Alaska, people might receive anywhere between $1,500 to $2,200. In Madhya Pradesh, it could be anything between $20 to $24. So it depends on the economy of the country. So some of these basic income experiments are still continuing at the moment, and there are some points to take from them. So, for example, data gathered from 75 reports indicates that actually, when we look at conditional and unconditional cash transfers, they improve the odds of being enrolled in and attending school compared to other transfer programs. So it benefits engagement in education because families are able to substitute, for example, the work that children do, so that they can go to education. Because in many countries, although education is now a human right, children continue to work because it's important for them to bring income to their families. Also, the analysis of data from 7 randomized controlled trials of government-run cash transfer in 6 developing countries throughout the world finds no systematic evidence that cash transfers actually discourage work. So there is very, very, very little evidence that if you receive a basic income, you are at risk of not being engaged in paid employment. And also evidence from 7 experimental government-run unconditional cash transfer programs showed that there is no evidence that the patterns of employment will change. So people continue to work in part-time employment. They continue to up their hours. So it doesn't indicate that there is less of an engagement in patterns of employment. So perhaps really importantly, it's this. So there is an actual basic income pilot being trialled in Wales, which is going to start later this year. And it means that people are going to be, particularly people who have been in care, young people who have been in care, are going to be receiving money from the Welsh government. And this is going to go on for 2 years. That's going to allow for more data to be gathered in terms of how, in this case, young people who have been in care are using a basic income to further their employment opportunities, to further their education opportunities, And universal basic income is not a new idea. It's been part of the politics discourse for a very long time. It's been included in the Green Party's manifesto since 2019. The Labour Party in Wales has also included it in its manifesto, and it's an idea that's actively discussed in politics, and it can and it will become, I think, more popular with time, particularly when you think that there are many changing patterns in work. Automation is also an important thing to consider, and the book, in fact, does have some reflections around automation and how that might affect the world of employment and work, and how a universal basic income might be the answer to continue to include people in society. So some of the discussions point to how a universal basic income is said to challenge capitalist society. Now, it's an interesting idea, but we found that actually a universal basic income is not so radical as to change the workings of a capitalist society. So many people still see a universal basic income as a policy which will radically change capitalist society. This is found in many parts of the theory. But a universal basic income is not developed to dismantle capitalism, I would say. On the contrary, in most cases, the arguments put forward to implement a universal basic income are based on the idea that a basic income is needed in order to allow capitalist societies to survive, to continue to change, and to adapt more effectively. But the introduction of a universal basic income can have the potential to address some of the work inequalities that we currently find in society. That's another important point. So, for example, a capitalism driven by neoliberal economics, emphasizing individuality and competition amongst people and rewarding those who can expertly move through the economics of individuation, is currently failing many in societies across the world, many hardworking people who can't get into the better parts of sort of the employment market. So a universal basic income has the potential to rescue some of the shortcomings of neoliberal capitalist society, because what we have seen in the past few years, is how the state is enfolding. So it's taking back a lot of its benefits. So it's shrinking, it's looking after its citizens less. It's given less money. We've had austerity for a very long time, since particularly since 2011 with the coalition government. And so this could really help to address some of the inequalities that have been left by those historical changes. So how could it do that? One of the things that I'd like to propose in this presentation is actually how it could change the way we think about work. And in the book, we wrote how it could reconceptualize the notion of work. So if we think about work is a very important part of not just the capitalist system, but also how we think about ourselves and other people in society. So, doing real work, and I say real here, sort of inverted commas, it seems that we are referring to earning a wage, that we work for a wage. This conception of work is nothing new. In the 1980s, the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, told the people in the UK that the Victorian work ethic must be revived, and people must do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. The work ethic, as it is known, makes people believe that they owe to work, whether they need to or not. And those who are not in work then suffer the stigma and the shame of being, for example, unemployed. In Britain, especially, where the notion of work ethic is most prominent, non-workers are seen as less valuable, and because they don't put in that sort of hard day's graft, they don't engage in that really important capitalist relation of work. So a universal basic income could help in reshaping how we think about the notion of work in society. So the work ethic is, of course, a discourse which is mates every corner of industrialized society. And yet, in most industrialized societies, more than half of the population are either too old to work, or too young to work, or too sick to work, or sometimes, too rich to work. So the very idea that everyone works or someone must work is in itself a fictitious narrative. And it's driven by a neoliberal discourse which is preoccupied with the importance of paid employment and the idea of inclusion in the labour market as the most important part of social participation. So as the 19th century sociologist Max Weber said himself, the idea that work in itself constitutes a value has its historical origin in particular parts of Europe following the period of the Reformation and extending into the 18th century. So the consequence here is that the neoliberal culture polarizes it, divides the notion of the work ethic within and with the idleness and even the contempt that we show as a society for those who, for any reason, are not able to engage in sort of traditional employment and work. So the philosophy and discourse of a universal basic income, in contrast, does not set up a division between the employed and the non-employed. On the contrary, it provides a more egalitarian and liberal discourse, which understands individuals as valued citizens of our society, whether they work in employment or not. So we proposed, particularly in the book, that a universal basic income could help to disrupt, really, the way in which we have traditionally and historically thought about work. And it could help reduce some of the ways in which social stigma is experienced by people. If you think about this, this is not just an idea, this is part of our popular culture. We've got programs on, for example, Channel 5, Benefit Street, where we have all of these programs that actually send this message that people who don't work and people who are on benefits somehow are always, less rational, less productive, a burden to society, that, we taxpayers have to carry these people with our income, with our tax. So that particular notion comes also from the idea of the work ethic. So, for example, theorists like Gause, who we also talk about, discuss his theory in the book. He reconceptualizes work and abandons the work ethic altogether. This is particularly talked about in chapter 2. Pressing for a universal basic income, he says that it has to be recognized that neither the right to an income, nor full citizenship, nor everyone's sense of identity and self-fulfillment can any longer be centered on and depend on occupying a job. So drawing on his theory and other Marxist theories, a universal basic income has the potential to take us beyond that wage-based society and allow for a system where there is no longer an exploitation of the wage relation. He argues for a universal basic income which is both unconditional and adequate for a decent existence in society. So rather than having the flexibility of workers, Gause argues for the flexibility for workers. On these terms, he believes that there can be an effective validation and adequate recompense for caring, voluntary work, and non-market activities. So a universal basic income combined with good public services and an ecologically sustainable urban regeneration can provide genuine inclusion and greater equality. And these are important ideas because I'm not sure if you remember a while back, all we were hearing was, we are all in this together, part of the big society. So David Cameron told this story for a very long time. And so people were asked to contribute to the communities, to volunteer, to keep services going because of the effects of austerity. Yet we continue to disregard the unpaid, unrecognized employment of many, many citizens in our society. So a universal basic income could actually show this sort of, the financial incentive, but also the recognition that people put into our society every day. So precarious workers is also an important part of how UBI can help. Is we live in a society where we're going in a very tricky direction, where our employment is very insecure. We have a lot of people working on 0-hour contracts. Very recently, there have been demands to end casualization, for example, in higher education. People are striking because of the, the threats to their pensions in higher education, just as an example, which is very close to us. But a lot of people have experienced insecurity, particularly after the pandemic, where many of the jobs that have been affected are actually the very same jobs that have traditionally always had less pay, more insecurity, less effective working conditions. So UBI could help in addressing some of that precarity that our societies carry and that they will probably continue to carry for a very long time. This is made worse by, big platform capitalist firms such as Uber or Facebook, Google, all of these different businesses that continue to, in many cases, evade taxes, find loopholes, not to contribute in the taxation system appropriately. So precarious work refers to this notion of insecure, non-standard work with unprotected and poor quality conditions. In recent years, this has been developed both as a theoretical notion, and also it's been studied in terms of who is more affected by precarity. You would not be surprised to hear that women, of course, are very, very much affected by precarious work. And this is why I wanted to link these two notions. So the idea of work, but also the idea of the work that women do, because they are interlinked. So in particular, there's been a shift from, let's say, manufacturing work to service sector work, a proliferation in the use of new technologies, and a demand for more flexibility in the workplace. So as a result of this, there's been a decline in standard employment contracts, people working on 0 hours, people working on very exploitative working conditions. And this has been called the gig economy. The gig economy is characterized by an unstable and insecure environment, which renders people and their labor as commodities to be bought, sold, and bargained with. More recently, Guy Standing, his book, The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class, provides an account of an emerging class of people who are facing these insecurities and continually need to move from a job to another job, which is as insecure, as the previous one. So Standing explains that we treat everything as a commodity to be bought and sold, subject to market forces, with prices set by demand and supply without effective agency or any capacity to resist. So commodification makes the division of labor within organizations more fluid. If work activities can be carried out more cheaply in one location than another, for example, they can be offshored, and a lot of this happens. We know, for example, the clothing industry is a very good example of this. So Standing argues that this uncertainty over whether jobs, the jobs that people might do, whether they are offshored and outsourced, they complicate the whole quality of life. So the whole life course is affected. And there is a strong link between people experiencing precariousness and also not finishing education, for example. We know that being expelled from education increases your chance of being criminalized, ending up in prison. So a whole lot of even living longer. People who are more educated tend to live longer lives. So everything is linked to that first start in life that we get through education. And also, there are questions to ask as to how can we continue to include people when education is finished, because education will stop at a certain point. I'm talking about compulsory education. What can we offer people in terms of social participation and social inclusion after that, apart from benefits? A universal basic income could give the answer. So these conditions that characterize the employment market at present, we argued in the book, could be counteracted slightly by the introduction of a universal basic income, which is not tested, dependent or sort of means tested on employment, and which is also trying to reach those people in society who are at a higher risk of becoming excluded. So, following from that notion of precarity and precariousness, I want to get into the reflections around women's work in society. So there's a huge amount of work, as I said before, which is unpaid work, and which is very important work happening in our society. So a universal basic income can't be fully understood unless we question the significance and the role that work and employment play in a society. In most societies, work occupies a large part of an individual's life. So, we tend to work, well, particularly, in current societies, post-pandemic, if we can call it post-pandemic, a lot of us are working very unsociable hours, over the weekend. Work will take as much time as you will give it, almost. So most people work to actually earn a living, or they rely on pensions and other benefits collected from taxes, which other employed people have contributed towards. So in common sense or lay terms, we usually define work as the task-based activities for which people are paid by an employer, by a customer, by a client, or because they themselves provide a service. However, this is a very unsociological and a common sense definition of work. It fails to recognize the huge amount of work which goes unpaid, which happens behind the scenes by people who are not recognized financially because of the work they do. For example, care workers who are employed by an organization, by a care home, they get a real wage. Not a very good wage, but they get a real wage. Whereas those carers who look after children, who look after partners, the elderly, relatives usually do not get paid at all. And despite the nature of the work being exactly the same in many cases, the social status of paid carers and unpaid carers is completely different, with the former having more recognition as well as having all the bits which employment can bring. For example, being paid holiday pay or sick pay, having a better pension. In the UK, for example, the ONS reported that some 6.8 million people were providing unpaid care in England and Wales in 2016. This is now set to be much, much higher, although the figures are still being worked out because of the pandemic, of course. So with women doing more unpaid work than men across all the age groups. So regardless of whether you're looking at young children, teenagers, adults, women will always shoulder more of that responsibility in the households, in the home, which means that they feel it's less likely that they will go into employment themselves. It's less likely that they will take themselves into the GP, so they suffer health issues, mental health issues. So carers aren't the only people who are unpaid in many societies. Many community workers are unpaid charity fundraisers, volunteers, people who do trials, work experience. They are essentially also working for free. So we asked some of these questions in the book. Why do we continue to unrecognize the contribution of all of these people? And could a UBI be a fair way to manifest that appreciation, to actually show some of that recognition to those groups of people who have been traditionally excluded from employment relations? Okay, so then there's also the notion of work and women who are working, so whether they're working full-time or part-time. And I found, as I wrote this chapter, that the views are very ambivalent, and this is probably going to provoke some debate later on, which I welcome. The book doesn't really, it doesn't kind of give an answer whether universal basic income is definitely a good thing for all women, But there are some important findings which I think should be highlighted, and I'll come to in a moment. But some of the views on whether universal basic income, although varied, they recognize that a universal basic income will have important effects on poverty, but it might not contribute substantially to shift structural inequalities that we see in our societies. Some feminist scholars who are in support of an income maintenance fund or a universal basic income have proposed how this regular payment will contribute to women's autonomy. It might increase their economic power and independence, as well as rebalance many of the gender inequalities that continue to exist in our society. So some people are in favor because it might contribute to the independence of women. It might mean that they have a budget that they can use to pay for parts of their life. It might help them to create, innovate, and form their own businesses, for example. But other feminist scholars are less enthusiastic about the idea of a universal basic income. And they suggest that it won't help diminish the gender inequalities that we see in our employment market. It's just one thing. It's not going to help us undo the gender division of labor that we still see in most of our societies. It probably won't even help reduce the pay gap. It might not even help increase the participation of women in employment. It might actually send women back home because they might find that it's actually better for them to be at home than to be going into work, because they have to spend money on transport, they have to spend money on childcare. So, for example, there are arguments that say that should a basic income be introduced, it would be reasonable to expect an overall drop in female labor. Differences in income might affect different groups differently, and a drop in women's bargaining power within the household, since they are less likely to retain their earnings. This might lead to lower self-esteem. It might lead to social isolation, and of course a loss of social capital. So there are really competing views in terms of how a UBI could help women both enter the world of work and also maintain themselves within the world of work. One of the cases I wanted to highlight here is, for example, how what we call the benefit trap tends to affect women more as well. So a universal basic income has the potential to relieve some of the problems associated with the benefit trap, in which benefit recipients can often be worse off financially when seeking employment or moving from benefits into employment. So this situation affects more women than men and has a bigger impact on women than men for two reasons. Firstly, because women are still seen as the primary carers of children and the elderly, and they are, as a social group, more likely than men to find themselves in this predicament, where their care responsibilities limit the type of work that they can carry out. So secondly, the benefit trap has a more significant impact on women because the lowest paid jobs and the per hour contracts, the 0-hour contracts in our society, are still largely occupied by women. They continue to be in sectors which are at a higher risk, such as retail, catering, care work, beauty, and childcare, just to name a few. They're still highly populated by women. And so, when women attempt to seek employment, whether this is part-time or full-time, they are more likely to be offered lower paid and lower status jobs and more insecure jobs than their male counterparts. So, additionally, after becoming mothers, women find it difficult to return to the employment market as well, with only 27% of women in full-time work or self-employment after childbirth, in comparison to 90% of men. This is a significant social fact, since it continues to affect the quality of life for women who are at a higher risk of living in income poverty. So even when women work, they're more likely to live in poverty. They're also more likely to suffer from the effects of precarious employment, sexual harassment, and sexual violence at work. they're also more exposed to a reduced income in their retirement. They also enjoy less pension benefits, and that, this is something that has been going on for a very long time, which is why, we had International Women's Day yesterday, for example, and it just seems a little bit, hypocritical that we celebrate such a day. I think we should, but the gender inequalities that we find in such an important area, which is employment and work, they have been historical, and they have not shifted substantially for the past 20 years. So there is definitely something which is not working in terms of the desire for governments to step in and really address gender inequalities. So this is something to think about, because I think a UBI here could potentially make a difference. It could actually create an environment that allows for women to feel more empowered to retain their positions, for example, after childbirth, which is such a difficult time. I mean, I've recently had two babies, which we might get disrupted in a moment. It might happen. And it's been so difficult to stay in full-time employment because of this constant juggling. And I think this really affects women who are also in lower paid employment. For me, it still makes sense to be in full-time employment because of my pay. But if you think about it, if I as a woman work in a retail shop, or which I've worked before many years, I worked in catering, and I know how much we get paid in those sectors. It does not make financial sense to go back to work when our childcare provision is so poor, and it starts so late. You only get help to send your child to preschool after they're 3. So people who are living in income poverty don't have that option, and they have to self-exclude because they need to look after their family. So I think UBI could make a difference here. UBI is also very significant for women in the global south. And I think that's also important to highlight, that in many of the pilots and the experiments that have been conducted in India, in Namibia, in Kenya, women benefit hugely from these experiments. They use this money to send their children to school, to have a more nutritious diet, to invest in things like bicycles, so they can move around the town, so they can secure employment. So it's very significant. It's very significant, and we need to think about this not so much focused on sort of our westernized way of life, but also how it could impact other people in countries which have a very, very different labor relation. So just to continue with this sort of thread of thought, I wanted to debate here how, for example, it could be very beneficial for caregivers. So this is another important debate that has surfaced from the arguments discussed before, and it is the extent to which the estate continues to ignore the work that is carried out by women, particularly in the privacy of the home. It's ignored because people can't see it. People, are normally really belittled by the work itself, so they feel that they have no voice. So such as the caring for children, the caring for ill relatives, the elderly, and other work. Even when you look at the label of young carers, for example, when we talk about children, it is primarily girls who shoulder a lot of this responsibility in the home. And they're not just caring for parents, they're caring for older siblings, they're caring for disabled relatives. So this is important across all the ages, not just when we look at the lives of women, but also the lives of young girls. So many of the feminist debates around universal basic income have considered the impact it could have on caregivers and on single mothers as well, which is a very important group, a group which is overwhelmingly female. So caregivers provide an enormous value to society, and yet their work is largely unrecognized. So this is in itself a result of care work being regarded as women's work. Women and the activities carried out by women are regarded as less important than the activities of men. Receiving a universal basic income would minimize the financial loss caregivers have from not taking part in the paid labor market. making their decision to look after the others less of an economic sacrifice, because many of the women that we're talking about might actually choose or feel that they're choosing to do that. But we know that there's also a system behind it, pushing them to be and to act in that role. So many arguments around universal basic income also consider its benefits for women who have taken breaks from employment due to homemaking or raising children, bringing a level of equality to activities that have historically been undervalued. However, other issues become central to feminist scholars and UBI when we think of women as caregivers. For example, there are arguments that point to how while a universal basic income might improve women's economic position, spending power, and the overall economic independence that they might have, it does very little in challenging the social norms which construct women as exclusively responsible for homemaking or domestic work. So there is a lot of skepticism of the potential that a universal basic income might have in helping women who are caregivers to go out into the world of employment. Potentially, universal basic income could be seen as a very tangible factor in continuing women's attachment to the home and in the role of caregivers, making it more difficult for women to pursue other types of employment, and therefore having little impact on the gender division of labor. So put simply, providing women with a regular cash income will not encourage them to leave the home, which unfortunately maintains the existing gender roles of men and women. So although evidence from, for example, the Alaskan Permanent Fund, it's shown that whilst more women have opted for part-time employment, they have not opted for staying at home. And that's significant because they have had this fund for a very long time, and they have produced a lot of data which can be looked at. And it's interesting that one of the findings is that actually the very group that people think is going to choose not to be employed has not left employment, but they have chosen to have a better kind of work family life balance. So they prefer to go for part-time employment and enjoy the benefits of the basic income at the same time, which is of course important because what women want to do should also be respected. So as part of the chapter on UBI and the work of women in the book, I also used the notion of intersectionality, which has been used by feminist and critical race theory for a long time, to think about how we need to think about the experiences of women as more complex. So the notion of intersectionality was introduced in the 1980s, and it opened up new ways to produce knowledge and understandings of inequality in an era which was marked by various social justice movements. Since then, intersectionality has encouraged more interdisciplinarity in various fields, including sociology, feminist theory, history, anthropology, and politics. So crucially, intersectionality exposed how there is a single axis thinking which undermines the way in which we think about identity and social justice. So intersectionality's potential lies in how it pushes us to examine the dynamics of difference and sameness, and how they have a major role in facilitating a consideration of gender, race, and other axes of power in a wide range of political discussions and academic disciplines. So ultimately, intersectionality is about power. It's about power affects people differently, how part of their identities interact with the system differently. So it's about a way of isolating and studying also and making visible inequalities that remain unseen if we only think of inequalities through class and gender distinctions, for example. So arguments around a universal basic income tend to overemphasize the experiences of women who might, for example, to a certain extent, be included in aspects of society already. Or who live in a capitalist society where they have some form of participation already in recognized patterns of employment and production. An intersectional approach to basic income could go beyond thinking of universal basic income as a way for the state to recognize unpaid and unrecognized work, and which women do in society, without deepening inequalities further. Intersectionality could help the debate around a universal basic income go beyond the gender inequalities focused on employment patterns or labour market representations for women. Instead, it could help extend the debates into other intersections of disadvantage and exclusion, particularly highlighting the international nature of gender inequality affecting women in the global south, who live in and around abject poverty, conservative, patriarchal societies, and in environments where they really enjoy very little freedom. So intersectionality opens up ways of thinking about the possibility and the possible impact of a universal basic income on women's lives from a more sort of multi-layered perspective of how varied women's lives can be. Such an approach also adds meaning and complexity to the ideas of who women are, what women do, what women think of their financial futures, how women live, how they can guarantee themselves, some sort of existence. Intersectionality is also about diversifying the ways in which gender interacts with class, race, age, religion, geographical location, culture. So to this effect, intersectionality interrogates the ways in which identities become intelligible and challenges the ways that institutions and societies sort of create an agenda for women's lives to be understood. So, for example, assuming that, all women want to work full time, all women want to be in employment 5 days a week. Like I said, UBI has actually shown that when women have the choice, they prefer to have a better work-home life balance, and they use the universal basic income or the basic income to give themselves that chance in a way that also allows them to retain pension benefits. That's very important because the lives of women after working ends, after they no longer have a working life, is also open to many inequalities. It is still astounding, the inequalities that women and that exist between men and women in terms of pension benefits. In Britain, for example, there are multiple layers of inequalities for women along the lines of not only gender, but also ethnicity, age, and social class. Women from Black and minority ethnic groups suffer from ethnic inequalities on top of and in combination with gender inequalities and discrimination. Many Black women's employment experiences are not only shaped by economic factors, but they're also shaped by sexism, by sexual division of labor, by cultural differences, and also racism. So it is in that intersection between these elements that defines the distinct position of, for example, Black women in the labour market, as neither equal to the position of white women, but also is not equal to the position of Black men. So racism describes the prejudiced and discriminatory organization of a society based on the ideological belief that there is inferiority grounded in race of color. And this continues to affect a lot of the experiences of work and employment of Black and minority ethnic women in not just in our society, but globally. So it's really important to focus on how intersectionality could also contribute to this debate, because even within the feminist theory and the studies that have been conducted, there is a very universal kind of there's a linearity to the experience of women, which I noticed, which doesn't really show the complexity of the lives of women all over the world. And like I said, it's actually really important to stop and think about how a universal basic income can have a very positive impact on women who live in less traditional, sort of capitalist societies where they themselves, don't have access to many of the rights and values that we have access in Europe. It's been extremely beneficial. The data that has come out of the experiments from India indicate how women enjoy a very significant level of freedom with the basic income, and also how it contributes to the whole family, to the integration of the whole family, and to the benefits for the whole family. So just to summarize some of this, the points of the presentation. So UBI is becoming more popular across the policy and the political and economic landscape. I don't think it's it's no longer some sort of radical idea. It's becoming part of the mainstream politics debate. Sorry, like I mentioned before, it's been part of the Green Party's manifesto for quite a few years now. It's also very interesting to see that Wales is actually starting a fresh experiment with basic income in April, directed at young people leaving care, and that is going to go on for 2 years. So there is, there is a chance to see the effects of the basic income on their lives. Hopefully, they will continue it. The future of work might depend on UBI, particularly since automation and AI continues to shape employment and labor relations. We know that many sectors of employment are going to be affected and are affected right now by these two developments. The notion of work, as we traditionally conceive of it, is under significant change, driven by market forces, many divisions, precariousness, like we discussed, the influence of what has been called platform capitalism. So UBI might actually guarantee a sense of equality for most people in precarious society, and also people who are in precarious employment. And remember, many of these people are actually young people and women. So the notion of intersectionality can help open up the potential that a UBI can have on the heterogeneous lives of women. And I think it's something that needs to be brought forward to this debate a lot more, because it's not prevalent within the sort of the feminist scholarship on UBI. And whilst there are various debates around UBI, data gathered from pilots and examples still suggests that the implementations have not reduced people's participation in employment, which is the first thing people say, that if people are going to get this free money, they're not going to work. And that people feel a greater sense of financial security and improved levels of mental health as a result of participating in the pilots and experiments. So I hope that's been interesting. I have kind of rushed through lots of very complex ideas, so I'm open to questions now. And hopefully we can debate a little bit further, what sort of effect you think UBI could have on the lives of women, and how it could help reshape the way in which we think about work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessie. Lots of food for thought there. I can see that people have been typing away in the chat, but if I could first of all ask if anybody would like to put their hand up and ask their question. Let me just see if I can see hands going up. Yes, so first off, Christopher Ryan has his hand up. Christopher, would you like to turn your mic on and ask your question?
Yeah, it's on. Can you hear me? I'm probably
yes, we can hear
you.
You.
Good.
Yes.
Well, I'm partly here to say hello, Jessie. Nice to see you again.
Hello, Chris. It's so good to hear your voice.
But I'm also going to ask you a very difficult question. I'm sorry. It's the game we have to play. Well, no, not difficult. It's more just a quest for clarification. I mean, you gave a very good exposition of caregivers and their undervalued work in our society and how it's ignored. And you propose UBI as a kind of solution to that. But I thought the issue with UBI is that it's universal. Everybody gets it. And I just wondered whether that would just shift the goals of inequality So if everyone gets it, so if your single guy gets it who doesn't have any dependents, then he has just more money to kind of more disposable income, or more money to spend on the stock exchange or invest in shares. Whereas if your single caregiver has it, then she just has, all right, to an extent it gives her more autonomy, but it doesn't give her an equal status. And I wondered whether UBI is really a solution to a lot of the problems, perhaps paying caregivers or recognizing that caregiving is actual work. And it just struck me that UBI was a kind of, too much of a universal solution to a more specific problem that you had identified and probably be useful to do something about. And I thought you might clarify some of that if you could.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you say, and it is interesting. I don't think it's a solution because, you know, society is far too complex to make the claim that, you know, this one change can sort of undo all of this traditional, historical, really stubborn inequalities that we know exist. So no, I agree. I think it has effects on different groups, and that is interesting. That, you know, for example, if you look at the effect of UBI on people who live in poverty, it seems to be very, very beneficial. There is less evidence that, you know, this makes such a huge impact on people who already, you know, have a sort of a very middle class life. But I do agree that, you know, this is not in itself going to undo, you know, the gender division of labor that exists in society. There is not really a single solution to these notions, and I think it's not really going to have a massive impact on improving the appreciation, the status of women in different parts of employment. So there is a lot to be considered in the arguments that I went through in terms of, you know, the feminist scholars who actually argue that this is not going to undo the gender division of labor. It's not going to undo some of the stigmatization that still women experience, for example, working full-time when they should be caring for their children, and, you know, etc. So that kind of ongoing construction is still out there, and it won't be undone by the introduction of a universal basic income. So I do not disagree with you. I think it's a very valid point, but it is interesting to try this out, though, in terms of, you know, the UK has never had such an experiment. The Wales is the first time that this is actually going to be trialed in the UK. So it would be interesting to see what kind of effects that might have on the different, you know, on the young people, whether there is a bit of a sort of a gender distinction as well between young women and young men. But, you know, I suppose we'll have to wait for that.
Thank you, Jessie. I mean, just listening to you, the kind of example that occurs to me, which is also universal, of course, is child benefit, which was introduced as a very radical measure to kind of address some of these inequalities that you're talking about, and it was made universal. So the example that's often given is that the Queen was entitled to child benefit for her 4 children. I doubt she ever claimed it. I hope she never claimed it. But because it's universal, it means everybody from Boris Johnson, who, as we know, would draw a very large sum in child benefit, given all of his many, many children, to the poorest parents in the country would be entitled to that universal income through child benefit. So it would be interesting to see how that, as a similar experiment in universal benefit, which was deliberately not means tested, but of course that was then subsequently changed by the Cameron administration, I believe, who put a cap on that. So yes, I mean, there are sort of predecessors to this kind of experiment. But I noticed that Chandrika had her hand up, but her hand is no longer up. So I don't know, Chandrika, did you want to ask a question? Hi.
Oh, hi there.
Hi.
I'm a Year 5 Education Studies student, and I just missed you, I think, Jessie, because you went on maternity leave, so I didn't get to learn from you. But anyway, hi. It was because it was very similar to what Chris was asking, but as nice as the idea is, and something that it'd be really good to see what the trials say, what's almost I find depressing about it is that unless you're sort of addressing the political environment or the culture of the society, it's just like, to me, bailing out banks. You know, you're giving people money. The idea that everyone's going to have it, you know, sometimes it should be that if you can see people are really struggling, it's sort of the market telling you something needs correcting. But because if you're in that country where things are very individualistic, or you're just meant to work harder, having a lot of money for things, you know, general prices will go up. If the rent can be paid, then the rent doesn't even ever need to come down, or prices for cars go up, or petrol can go up. It's just sort of general attitudes to spending money. I don't really see how it would change, and it is quite depressing because it could be something that's very free and that you'd think lots of people would spend it on all sorts of things, but I don't know. Obviously I haven't read enough on it, but I don't, yeah, it's just a general.
Yeah, I agree though, Chandrika, that for such an idea to work, you know, if there's an introduction of something similar to this, a basic income, or, you know, a less universal one, it has to be enacted within a society that still retains some sort of security and integrity, that provides a, you know, a level of quality of life through many other services and offers, and not just make this the only offer and hope that people will make the most of it, you know, and leave them be. I think that it has to be enacted within a society where, you know, there is still a net of support, where you still access good services that are not, you know, means tested. So I agree. I think it still needs to be implemented within a, you know, by a government that offers some sort of, you know, social security. It won't just work on its own.
Thank you, Jessie. I don't see any other hands up at the moment. Would anybody else like to put their hand? Oh yes, Brian has put his hand up. Hello, Brian.
Right, thanks, Louise. Just to respond as well to Chandrika's question, really good question on you know, how would a UBI resolve all of these issues, and I think so there's a little bit of pessimism maybe, and I feel the same, that actually UBI won't resolve every single issue. And I think, as you know, Jessie's presentation has illustrated, that it's not going to resolve issues related to women and the sort of social inequalities around women in the domestic sphere, the care sphere, and so on. But I just want to say that I think that UBI is probably on the whole a better thing than the current welfare state, and I think that's how we should see it. I don't see it as a big sort of kind of like radical change, as some people see UBI. I don't see it as that radical. We pay in taxes huge amounts, you know, so if you have a full-time job, you'll know how much tax you pay out of your income. And all of the arguments around UBI is that no more tax needs to be paid in order for a UBI to operate. So that's the first thing, and I know Jessie said that very clearly from the experiments and the research that's been done on UBI, that it would not cost anything more. But if you just think about the welfare system the way it is, particularly in Britain, it's in a real state. You know, the welfare state in the UK is not fit for purpose. It's on its knees, basically. And one of the big factors is the whole means-tested aspect of the current welfare state. You know, where you got to fill out a load of forms, the whole bureaucracy of the welfare state in the UK, and UBI actually puts an end to all of that, because it's universal. Everybody gets a basic income, and I like there was a question in the chat just on sort of, you know, the amount of UBI that might be put forwards, and I think that the Wales experiment, £1,600 per month, is a really good, I think is a realistic amount of what could be paid if a universal basic income was implemented in the UK. And if I just add just one more quick point, imagine not getting, so they've done this for a two-year experiment in Wales, £1,600, which amounts to £38,000. There's another idea in the US circulating, which is it's called Stakeholder Society. It's where you get $80,000 when you turn 21, and you give it back when you die as from your estate if you have $80,000 when you die. The idea of, imagine getting it £38,000 up front. Imagine not getting it per month, but imagine getting it up front. How that might pay for putting a deposit on a property, or pay for a startup, a new business, or help towards paying for fees for courses or an apprenticeship. So the idea of I think the idea of the Wales experiment is really, really fascinating, really interesting, and it'll be fascinating to see what comes out of it.
Thanks, Brian. Maybe I can just go straight to the next question because I'm conscious of time. Claire, you have your hand up. Hello, Claire. Can you hear us? We can't hear you. Hi, Claire. Hi. Hello, Claire. We seem to have lost Claire. Claire, maybe we can just come back to you in a minute, Claire, because I can see that Kevin has his hand up. We'll come back to you in a minute, Claire. Kevin, do you want to turn your microphone on? Hello, Kevin. Hi.
Hi there.
Kevin. Hi,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Jessie, for such a brilliant presentation. I was just thinking about what we were talking about. I just wanted to understand, like, is this UBI an idea to change the whole of welfare, or are we speaking specifically around things like universal credit? Because if we're thinking about the whole welfare, there's so many different sections of it. I'm just trying to understand around that, and just because I don't know, it sounds like a reasonable idea, but I'm just anxious of the cost and how would they work?
Yeah, no, UBI is not supposed to replace welfare benefits. So UBI would be an extra layer of support, and a sort of an extra layer of financial support. So it's not made or proposed as a way to, substitute benefits.
Okay, because I was just trying to understand, like, how would they differentiate that, because it's a bit complex, because I'm just thinking about when I think about like single parents, and yeah, so I think I'm still struggling with this idea, I need to read more about it to understand it, because
no, there are lots of practical questions around it. Like, some people ask, is it affordable? How would you actually do it, administratively? Like, how would you actually make this payment to people? The thing that we have in the UK is we actually have an infrastructure. The UK has had these long-standing systems for a very long time, which have now, many of them, just gone digital. So, in terms of the digitization of systems, the UK, is at a good level for that to happen. So it wouldn't really be a problem, to do this. Like, for example, when the experiments I talked about, many of these experiments, people are giving cash. They're not even given money in an account, because they have taken some of these experiments into really rural areas in Kenya, in India. So they actually have made, and that's why they're called, the cash transfer experiment, because they actually give people the cash, and they then examine, sort of follow and stay with these people for many of these cases for years, to actually explore how they're using it, what kind of advantages or disadvantages it might be having on their lives. A lot of people also say, oh, people will just drink it away, and in fact the evidence points to, you know, the other direction. Some people will do it, but it's a very, very little proportion. Most people really use the money meaningfully and purposefully.
Thank
Okay,
you, Jessie.
thank you.
I guess those countries you've mentioned, coming back to Kevin's point, don't have a welfare state in the way that
No,
there is in Britain.
that the
So
UK has.
it's looking at an experiment where, as you said, the Wales example, where it's being combined with an existing welfare state. But I'm keen to come back to Claire, because Claire was trying to come in earlier, but I think she was having microphone problems. Claire, are you able to ask your question now? Is your microphone playing ball? I can't see Claire. So I'll jump on ahead, because I can see that Joanne has her hand up. Joanne?
Yes, I was thinking about, because I sort of think of it on a world scale, and thinking of large multinational companies that don't sort of pay their full tax or anything like that, and yet we're sort of worrying about giving other people money. And it's like previously, when there was the tax credit that did a lot of good for people, so that they could feed their kids, think about getting jobs, all sorts of things, or staying at home and looking after their kids, because we have this ideal that everyone should be working, and a lot of people will be going to work and paying other kids the same wage that they're earning to look after their children while they're at work. So it's a problem. It's also a problem of how we consciously think of that person as well, whether that person should be at work or be at home looking after their kids, or whether it's a disabled person or a pensioner. So it's about that as well, because also for pensioners abroad, their pensions stop rising with the current government as well. So there's a lot of things that come into this as well. So that's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, Joanne. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'm just conscious of time, and I can see that Heather has typed a question in the chat about pensions. So perhaps if you can just have a look at Heather's question, and then maybe you can combine your answer to Joanne and Heather together, if that's okay, in the interest of time. And then maybe Claire, Claire, if you could be typing your question in the chat, we'll try to be multitasking for the remaining few minutes. Jessie.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Louise. Yeah, so that's an interesting question, Heather, because I think one of really pressing inequalities at the moment in the working lives of women is pensions. You know, so women are far more likely to take breaks from employment because of, you know, childbirth, or also they're far more likely to then, after having children, to go to part-time employment or leave employment altogether for years. So their pensions are severely affected if you compare it with, you know, the pensions of men who have children. So there is definitely something to think about, whether, you know, UBI could have an effect on that, you know, whether you could use some of that money to top up pensions. To that is I think it's I haven't actually come across any data in relation to that, because it's, you know, some of the examples that I went through, and some of the examples that have been that have happened, have not really looked at that as a, you know, as an aspect, since they're looking at people who are still paying into pensions. They're not really at that sort of pensionable age. So it would be interesting to see whether it has an effect on you know, pensions for women, and also, you know, for men. But it would be interesting to see whether that is, some of that money is put towards that, because it is a very you know, it's an ongoing inequality, and it affects women particularly severely. And
for Joanne's question, was there a dimension about care and carers?
Yeah, no, I think really, really interesting how you started your proposition, Joanne, saying, you know, we're questioning so much whether we should give people money where when we know that there are so many important aspects of taxation that are not working at the moment, you know, where people don't pay tax appropriately, except for, you know, for us, the citizens, you know, we do get taxed monthly quite effectively. So, you know, but that sort of thinking is also part of the sort of the theoretical part of UBI, that it could help change and shift that societal way of thinking. This, like I mentioned in the presentation, this kind of stigma that exists when we know people are not working, and, you know, kind of challenge that polarity that arises from this notion of the work ethic. Those who do not work, who do not contribute, they should not have the same level of participation, etc. So it could help change some of that. Yeah. I'm not sure if there's anything else that I can comment on that.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up. We've got a few minutes left. There are questions in the chat.
Chris Ryan has got his hand up.
Yeah, I can. But I can
again,
see
is that an old hand or a new hand, Chris? Because you asked a question earlier.
It's a new hand.
It's a new hand. Okay, go for it.
Big Mouth is back. Sorry, Jess. I mean, I read some of this, and I find it a fascinating area. But I just wondered, and you've read around it way more than I have, and you and Brian. I just wondered if there's any less experiments or, you know, empirical data, but any expectation that this could lead down fairly dystopian, if it became more widespread. I just worry about the relation between being a taxpayer and having therefore a certain control over the government, you know, in terms of, you know, terms like there's no such thing as a free lunch. Whoever pays the piper calls the tune. No representation without taxation, and could it be the convertible no taxation? You know, does the fact that I'm a taxpayer mean that I have a certain resistance or power over the government? And if they're paying me, does that work in reverse? And I just wondered if anyone has been writing on this in this area.
That's really interesting, because I think
something about
taxation, and increasingly we see taxation is used as a, you know, it's part of political agendas to meet a political end. Absolutely. I think any, you know, recent discourses around taxation, who's getting taxed more, who's getting taxed less, who's not paying tax, this is a really important political debate. It's a you know, a very hotly debated aspect of politics, and it does draw people in differently. It's also used to manipulate groups. But this is why, for example, people like Guy Standing is really backing basic income, for instance. He's a very important figure behind the movement of basic income in the UK, because, for example, he believes that basic income could really help deal with some of the inequalities that the precariat, as he termed it, are suffering, are experiencing. And he says this is important to us because these are people who also become politically isolated, and they are at a higher risk of becoming exploited by extremist groups. You know, they become a very small, dangerous minority. So, you know, he believes that UBI could actually help bring in some of these people back into kind of mainstream society, and also give people a more decent quality of life through, not just through the notion of UBI, but, you know, through the enjoyment of a less risky employment life. So, you know, different views. I do agree taxation is a political debate, but also it's a political instrument. That's something that perhaps we could have talked about a little bit more in the book. We didn't, because, you know, there's only so much you can put in a book. But that's something that I've thought about in terms of UBI, particularly how it could impact politically, and how it could have an impact on how then taxation is thought about as a political instrument.
Thank you, Jessie. I'm just conscious of time, and there are 2 hands up. I'd like to ask Maria first, because Brian has already had a go. So Maria, would you like to ask your question first, and we can come back to Brian then if there's time?
Yes, no, a very, very good point, and then we can go to Brian. I'm just looking forward to listen to him. It's about this taxation as a political instrument, and I just wanted to give you an example. This was happening in Spain. They gave the benefits, or this money, or easy money. They didn't call it UBI or anything, but they just gave it to people in rural areas in south of Spain, and that created a lot of resentment with people in the north because of this taxation. So immediately, people in the south of Spain, in the rural areas in Andalusia and Extremadura and many other places, they started to live and enjoy a quality of life, very good quality of life, comparing to the people in those areas, urban areas, that, as we do here, we have to pay for everything. And that created a clash and resentment. So I think the point, and I will just let Brian talk, I think the point is a very interesting, a very good point, that this is the intersectionality as a way of micro and looking very closely to areas in which that would be useful without causing, as I said, resentment, linking that to this taxation as a political instrument, because that was very, very much used by independence in Catalonia and everything, like, we pay for you, we pay for your life, and you're not working enough, and you enjoy the sun, enjoying the beaches, and enjoying everything. So yeah, that wonderful topic. So I let Brian talk now. Thank you, Jessie.
Thank you, Maria. No, Spain is really interesting because of that, isn't it? Because of all the micro politics between the states.
Yes.
Which I know because of, I'm Venezuelan, so I know a lot about Spain. But yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you.
Right, so Brian, and then maybe we can just move towards a conclusion at that point. Brian.
Just a quick one. Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Maria. Just a quick one to respond to Chris's really good question, and I think it's really about some UBI philosophers, theorists would use the idea of a citizen's income, because, or a stakeholder society. So the idea is that you've got a stake in society, and Chris is quite right. Hold on, actually. And Chris is quite right that obviously brings a different political. I'll come in a minute. This is negotiation, so political negotiation, that you have a stake in something, and I think that having that stake is really, really a key part of UBI. Absolutely.
Yep, thank you, Brian, and hello to the little person in the background who's joining us. You're obviously in demand there, Brian. So,
that's right.
As we are coming just to the last few minutes, are there any more quick questions? Did Claire manage to type her question in the chat? No, I don't see Claire's question.
No.
Oh, okay. So if there aren't any other final questions, maybe I can just hand over to Jessie to just give us a final wrapping up remark. Jessie, thank you very much.
No, I want to thank you all for listening to my talk. It's been very stimulating. I needed something like this, after lockdown and social isolation for so long. It's been really enjoyable, and it's really good to see, the different points and the different ideas. Some of the things that I had thought about, and some other things that, I thought that's interesting. The point on taxation is definitely something to think about. And the use of intersectionality, I think, is also really needed in how the impacts of a UBI, could play out in the lives of women. So it's something to think about further. But thank you. I hope it's been enjoyable, and I hope that it's given you a little bit of an outline of what's in the book. However, the book is more extensive. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessie. It was very thought-provoking, certainly a lot of food for thought there. So in the chat as well, Anna from the research office has also been typing about the next events which are forthcoming in the seminar series. So if you are joining our seminar series today for the first time, please visit the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre website and you'll see all of our other really interesting forthcoming events. So on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Maria Lopez,